So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Chris Jackson, a seasoned political pollster and Senior Vice President of Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Greetings, everyone. Thanks for being here, for joining us today. It seems to be an eventful day. So I'm going to run through a couple of topics. This is sort of our first peek at the landscape leading up to the 2022 U.S. midterms, the latest in our Ipsos public opinion polling and research. And then again, as Ellen said, if we have time at the end, would love to get questions. You can submit them at any time using the Q&A field. So we're going to go through a couple of different topics. First, we're going to sort of have like a big picture sort of takeaway on sort of where the American public is, the American psyche is right now. Zoom in on some of the major issues the country is confronting: the economy, COVID, misinformation, free speech, and then finally turn to the election and what we think is going to happen this November. There's, of course, a lot of other issues that are sort of emerging. Ukraine, of course, we have actually a poll in the field right now that we'll have data coming out in the next day or two to be able to speak to how the public feels about that. But I'll speak to what we do have to this point as well. So the American psyche, where's the American public? Well, honestly, the American public is generally in kind of an unhappy place right now. This is from our core political tracking, our weekly core political tracking, and you can see that a large majority of Americans think the country's going off on the wrong track. That is, things are not good, basically, and only about a quarter of Americans, 27%, think things are going in the right direction. There's very much a partisan influence of that, with Democrats being generally a little bit more positive, 46% right track there, versus Republicans who are very negative, and independents kind of in between. But even among Democrats, you can see not even half of Democrats think the country's going in the right direction, which I think illustrates sort of this malaise people are feeling across the country, even people from the president or the party holding Congress right now. And we see that sort of reflected a little bit on what people are looking at in terms of the main issue. And there's not really a single issue that's dominating the national debate right now. The economy is sort of the most mentioned topic, but it's not necessarily dominant in the way it was, for instance, after the Great Recession, 2009, 2010, nor is health or public health or the healthcare system as dominant as it was at various times during the COVID pandemic. And indeed, if we actually break this down a little bit more detail, you can see that people of different political persuasions have different topics that they're looking at. Republicans are very interested in the economy, also immigration and crime. Those are sort of top tier issues for Republicans. Democrats, on the other hand, are sort of all over the place: the economy, healthcare, public health, the environment, inequality, and then finally independents are a little bit more narrowly focused on the economy and crime, but even they have a little bit of a diffuse set of topics that they're sort of coming to top of mind. And what that means is that we're in a very sort of noisy and messy issue landscape where there's not really a single thing that people are uniting behind or uniting in concern. People have lots of individual concerns, which means that sort of the issue landscape, sort of the public debate, as it were, is going to be sort of very noisy with lots of competing voices talking about different issues going forward. And as I was mentioning, we don't have specific Ukraine polling about Ukraine yet, but as of last week, we could see only about 3% of Americans said that war or foreign conflicts was one of their top tier issues. Now that's up from about 1 or 2% a few weeks ago, but that's still definitely not a dominant issue or dominant concern. That's likely to climb more as the media focuses on it and people sort of hear more about the issue, but it's unlikely to sort of dominate debate in the way that the pandemic did or the economy has. So looking at sort of the top tier issue, the issue most Americans are looking at, the economy, and there's a little interesting sort of disconnect happening a little bit with the economy. So first off, this is from the Ipsos Consumer Confidence Tracker, a survey we've been running since 2002, looking at American consumer sentiment. The chart on the bottom is the entire 20-year time series, and then there's the little excerpt on the top. That's really the last year and a half, 2 years almost at this point. And you can see again, over the long time period, there's a big drop in 2008, 2009 when the Great Recession happened, though it's a drop that actually occurred over about 2 years, a decline in confidence, and then a very long recovery from that. And then after the pandemic started in March of 2020, a very sudden drop, and then a relatively rapid recovery back from that, and then sort of a stalling that we've seen since last fall. And if you look at that sort of zoomed in version, you can see that the recovery happened relatively consistently from the start of the pandemic, and most pointedly in the first and second quarter of 2021. And that's essentially as the vaccine was rolling out and people were thinking the pandemic was behind us. We sort of got to a high point in June, summer of 2021, where consumer confidence was actually essentially at a pre-pandemic level, was at a very good positive level. And then it sort of collapsed a little bit, and it hasn't necessarily gone back down as much as it was at the start of the pandemic, certainly not nearly as bad as it was during the Great Recession, but this is essentially the effect of the Delta and then Omicron variant sort of knocking consumer confidence back a little bit. And there's an interesting, once you start drilling into the data, sort of some interesting trends that emerge. One is that there is a very strong connection to sort of your material well-being and your view on the economy. So this is consumer confidence. This is actually job security, perceived job security. So this is one question that goes into our consumer confidence index by income, household income threshold. So less than 50 is the teal line, 50 to 100. So that's about median income is the blue line, or 100,000 or more. That's sort of upper income is the purple line. And you can see at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone was actually kind of about the same place. Everyone was kind of panicking together. But then as the pandemic has sort of worn on, and as we've sort of gotten used to it, you've seen more affluent households have become more confident and more stable in their circumstances. And it's sort of gone up and down a little bit, but it's definitely a big difference has sort of become pronounced as the pandemic has worn on versus less affluent households who have continued to sort of feel insecure during the pandemic, to the point where even now less than half of them feel confident about their job security. And what this sort of says is that the pandemic has not necessarily been equal for everyone, and particularly for people who are in sort of lower income thresholds, they're still very much struggling. There's still a lot of insecurity, even as more affluent, more professional people have really been able to sort of move beyond sort of the more, day-to-day sort of concerns into sort of more large concerns. Sort of more esoteric concerns rather. But then there's another dimension that has had a really big impact as well on how Americans are viewing the state of the economy, and that's politics and partisanship. So this is, again, our consumer confidence tracker broken out by the consumer confidence number for Republicans and Democrats. In early 2020, Republicans were much more confident about the shape of the economy. Going into this is essentially during the recession, during the COVID pandemic. Republicans were very positive about the state of the economy. 50 is sort of an average number, so Republicans were above average. And then the election happened in 2020, and you saw Republican confidence drop, Democratic confidence climb. Biden was inaugurated in office, Republican confidence continued to go down, Democratic confidence continued to go up. And we essentially had a reversing of that situation where Republicans now are less confident about the shape of the economy, Democrats are more confident, and there's nothing fundamentally different about their actual personal finances. Like, their experience with job losses have not materially changed. It's just that sort of party in power. Your party runs the government, your party does not run the government. That has changed it. And what that really has indicated is that American views of the economy are increasingly tied to politics and tied to their view of politics in the country. So that right track, wrong track number I started this off with looking at, and the Republican really negative views of that, maybe it's about the direction of the country, but a lot of it's about politics. And there's not going to be a lot of changing for Republicans, particularly, there's not going to be a lot of changing of their attitudes as long as Biden and Democrats are in the White House. So I think we're going to see essentially sentiment about the economy, sentiment about the country staying at relatively low levels because it's driven by so much of this political conflict. So the other big issue, COVID-19. So we've just sort of gotten through the Omicron surge. We're sort of at the back half of it, hopefully. We're seeing case numbers dropping rapidly, death rates dropping, not unfortunately quite as rapidly, but still dropping. And we have in our Axios coronavirus tracker have followed sort of the American public behavior over this period. And what we're essentially seeing is that every time there's another surge in the pandemic, there's another sort of spike in cases, a new variant, whatever, there is an uptick in sort of people taking protective behavior, but each one of those upticks is kind of smaller than the one before, where you just don't see quite as many people sort of stopping their behavior each time. And what this is essentially telling is people are sort of getting used to the pandemic. But even in this period, you're still seeing a lot of people sort of being very reserved, sort of holding back a little bit, trying to protect themselves. So, for instance, in our most recent Axios wave, which was about 2 weeks ago, we saw about half of Americans had been out to go out to eat or visit friends and family, but equally about half of Americans are saying that they're wearing a mask at all times, they're social distancing. So there is still a lot of protective behavior, even as we're sort of trying to sort through this really sort of muddled, murky period. And I think that muddled murkiness has really led to some of the pessimism we're seeing in that overall number. But also here, this is a question we've been asking, when do you think you're going to be able to get back to normal? When we asked this last year, a little over a third, 39% said it'd be a year or more for now. Another third, 35%, said it'd be within the next year, and then the remaining remaining quarter or so of Americans said that'd be maybe sooner than that. And what we've seen is that America sort of moved in two directions since then. So when we re-asked this question a couple of weeks ago, we see that almost half of Americans are saying it's going to be a year or more for now. But at the same time, an increasing number of people are saying, you know what, I've already gone back to normal, or I'm going back to normal in the very near future. And people are sort of moving further apart from each other. And that's another aspect of our sort of bifurcated American experience right now. And honestly, that those numbers really do sort of correlate a little bit with partisanship, right? Where Democrats are the ones more likely to say it's going to be a while, Republicans are the ones saying they're already getting back to normal. So it's just another fault line in our society that is dividing the public. But some of these views are sort of mitigated by how we're consuming our information. So this is that same question, when are we going to get back to normal? Broken out by Republicans and Democrats, and where Republicans are getting their news from primarily and Democrats getting their news from primarily. And you can see that particularly on the Republican side, Republicans who are getting their news from sort of mainstream TV news sources, ABC, CBS, NBC, are much more likely to sort of have a cautious attitude about returning to normal versus Republicans who are primarily getting their news from conservative media like Fox or digital or online news sources who are much more sort of already out there, already getting back out in the world. There's not quite as much of that effect with Democrats. There's a slight effect there, but again, it sort of shows how even within partisanship, where you're getting your information from is really shaping your view of the pandemic and shaping your view of how quickly, if at all, we'll ever be able to get back to normal. Speaking of getting back to normal, increasingly Americans are not actually expecting to be able to get back to some sort of pre-pandemic world. So when we recently asked if Americans think that we're going to be able to get rid of coronavirus or get rid of COVID, which was sort of the stated intent for the first part of the pandemic, increasingly the majority of Americans are saying no. 64% in our recent poll with Axios said that we would not be able to eradicate coronavirus in the next year. Pretty much bipartisan sentiment that is essentially we just have to learn to live with this. And potentially as a consequence, we do see the large majority of Americans, 70%, say that they're okay with the idea of getting a regular sort of annual COVID booster shot, much like you get like a flu shot every year, as part of this living with COVID, as this sort of adjusting to some sort of new level of normality. But finally, when we ask people sort of what should the country be doing to handle the pandemic, there is no consensus. And this is, I think, why we see still so much sort of conflict and disagreement and consternation with the American public. So when we asked people, we essentially broke it up into sort of 4 categories that were basically, we should just stop all the restrictions and go back to normal. We should keep some restrictions, but maybe move back towards normal. We should sort of keep things just like they are, or we should lock down harder to protect people's and protect public health. And we essentially saw that the American public was almost evenly split between those 4 conditions, opening up completely to locking down more. And again, those responses really did sort of fall out by party. You could see that on the right, with Republicans much more being in that sort of, let's move back to opening up, the large majority, including 43% that sort of wanted to, stop all restrictions. And then Democrats being much more sort of to the, let's keep restrictions in place, let's keep mandates or requirements in place to sort of protect public health, maybe not overwhelmingly in favor of sort of stronger lockdowns, but definitely more towards the cautious side. And you could essentially see here, again, Republicans and Democrats, very, very different views of the pandemic, very different views of what should be happening next. So to misinformation. So this is actually an increasingly important part of the debate going on in American society, or even society around the world. Misinformation and sort of intentional misinformation has been very much part of what's going on in Ukraine right now, with the Russian government launching all sorts of misinformation efforts to try to, sort of confuse what's going on there. But here in the United States, sort of the biggest piece of sort of debate about what is real or what is not is about the 2020 election. And this is still very much a core facet of Trump and Trumpism and sort of Trump's sort of grief with what has happened. And we can see that a significant number of Americans, 28% as of polling we did in December, still think that Biden won the election because of vote fraud. It's down slightly from where it was last year, but still a substantial number of Americans who believe that. And when we sort of break that down further, we can see that partisanship and information source have a huge, huge impact to whether you believe that to be true or not. So this is, we asked it as a true or false, that there's no evidence of widespread voter or election fraud that affected the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. That statement is true. There is no evidence of widespread voter fraud. Every piece that has been brought to any sort of court has been thrown out. There have been a couple of instances of individual voters who did something illegal, none of which would have had anything to do with the actual results. And yet 23% of Americans said that this is false, including 48% of Republicans and 51% of Fox or conservative news viewers. So this sort of alternate realities, these sort of alternate information landscapes are increasingly part of what's going on, where Republicans and Democrats aren't even perceiving the same fundamental events about society. And a lot of that is coming from, again, sort of these alternate news streams telling different versions of the story with greater or lesser degree of facts behind them. And then part of that, and a lot of the criticism that we'll see about sort of efforts to clamp down on misinformation, particularly that when it's sort of targeted more at social media, is about free speech and sort of restrictions on free speech. And what we can see actually is the debate about free speech is very interesting. This is from the General Social Survey. It's a long-running, very high-quality piece of research that's been done in the United States since the 1970s. And they've asked a series of questions. Should various individuals be allowed to make speech, which is sort of a weird way of saying it, but it's whatever. And what you can see from this data is that the idea that communists or people who are anti-religious should be able to make speech has sort of grown and become more widely accepted over time. But the idea that a racist should be able to make speech had been flat for a long period of time and then has fallen significantly over the last couple of years, since 2016, really. And what we're essentially seeing is that the definition of what is reasonable or tolerable speech is sort of changing. And as a consequence, we're seeing people sort of weaponizing the idea of free speech to defend their various points of view. And we actually recently did some research with the Knight Foundation, which is an organization that's dedicated to the First Amendment, free speech, freedom of the press. And one of the questions we asked in that survey was, do you have an easy or hard time expressing your free speech rights? And then do these various other groups have an easy or hard time expressing their free speech rights? And one of the things that really came out in this that I found most interesting or noteworthy is that people feel that people that are on sort of the other side from them politically, even sort of in terms of race or ethnicity, have an easier time expressing themselves than they do, right? So I think everyone else has an easier time expressing themselves than I have. And you can see that, for instance, in the Republican number, 4.1 on average is how they rated themselves. But then they rate Black Americans at 5.1, liberals at 5.9, LGBTQ people at 5.3, Black Lives Matter activists at 5.6. So essentially Republicans are saying all of these groups have an easier time expressing themselves than I do. And then you look at Democrats, on average 4.7, but they say white Americans, 6.1, have an easy, average score is 6.1 on that scale of hard to easy. So again, sort of reflecting that sort of out groups have an easier time. Wealthy people 6.4, conservatives 5.4. And then if you even look sort of at the far right between white and black, there is an interesting sort of interesting one, particularly when you look at Black Americans. Black Americans essentially feel like white people have an easy time expressing themselves, and then virtually everyone else does not. And I think it really sort of illustrates this sort of tension that we're seeing in sort of public debate, where everyone is feeling sort of aggrieved, everyone is sort of feeling like they are being put out, that they are having a hard time having their voice heard, even if they are in fact having their voice heard. And this sort of sense of persecution, this sort of sense of injustice, whether real or imagined, is driving a lot of the energy we see in the debates, a lot of the animosity we see in the debates. All right, so finally, election 2022. So first off, let's look at the sort of the issue landscape. Increasingly, as we're sort of getting accustomed to the pandemic, the American public is shifting focus to the economy as what they think Joe Biden should be prioritizing, compared to March 2021, so shortly after he assumed office. The number of Americans saying that the economy should be his number one priority has shot up 9 points. COVID's come down 15 points. And then sort of other issues are just kind of treading water, maybe moving up a little bit. So you can see the environment's gone up a little bit, immigration's come down slightly. But you know, those are all kind of in the same place. It's really that shift from in the pandemic view, which is where he sort of came into the office, to a fix the economy view is sort of the focus now. But I think that whole in the pandemic being less important is maybe understating sort of what's going on, because a lot of the economy, the views of the economy, are about the pandemic and about getting the pandemic under the control to the extent people feel like they can re-engage with the economy. So I don't think that you can totally take those two apart. They're linked together. And what we can see with Joe Biden is that the public's views of him have really cooled across the last year. This was probably going to happen no matter what, though I think that the steepness of these slopes is maybe probably worse than it had to be for him. I think the administration has sort of struggled to have a consistent positive message that they've told to keep particularly Democrats on their side. But you can see particularly on the response to coronavirus, this is the reason that Joe Biden won the election, right? Is that he was going to take care of the pandemic. And we could see, back in March of 2021, the public was very positive on his handling of the pandemic. Remember, this is when the vaccines were just starting to roll out. People were very positive. But even by July, and that's right as sort of the Delta surge had started kicking in, you saw a notable cooling And then as sort of the pandemic has worn on and we've not been able to get behind it, Omicron has sort of come into existence in December and that's sort of gone on. We've seen his position on the pandemic slide down to about 50%. Approval, still technically a positive number, but very, very much weaker. And all of his other numbers have sort of slid along with that. So we've seen his numbers on the economic recovery have slid. His numbers on rebuilding infrastructure have slid. He's really lost ground across a number of issues. And I do think it's really all sort of attributable back to the fact that he's not been able to get the pandemic under control. Whether he was ever actually going to get the pandemic under control, aside, the public thinks that was his responsibility and he's not been able to do so, and that is damaging him, and it's damaging the Democratic Party, who are the ones that are actually going to be facing the electoral consequences this November when the midterm elections happen. All members of Congress are up for re-election, a third of the Senate are up for re-election. And remember, the Democrats control Congress by very small margins. They control the Senate basically because it's a tie in the Vice President Harris is a tie-breaking vote, so that gives them control of it. So like any losses essentially means that they lose control of one or the other chamber of Congress. And what we can see right now is that their position versus the Republicans, Democrats' position versus Republicans, is not terribly strong on that number one issue, the economy. So right now, the American public gives Republicans a small advantage on the economy, 38 to 34%. It's not huge, but honestly, again, not huge is still probably enough given how closely divided Congress is. And you can see Democrats still have stronger positions on COVID and healthcare and the environment, and then they're basically tied on immigration. But this is really going to be sort of the landscape, is like which party does the public feel is going to be better for the economy? And then how does sort of the rest of this kind of noise, the sort of the misinformation, all the crazy, how does that sort of distract or focus attention on sort of that economic issue? And you can see it sort of playing out. Biden sort of weakening approval ratings, Democrats sort of softer views of their party's performance. When we look at Democrats and Republicans' stated certainty to vote. So this is, we ask a question, how likely are you to vote in the election? On a 1 to 10 scale, this is the number saying that they're a 10, they're completely certain to vote. In 2018, so this was the midterm election where Democrats won a bunch of seats when Trump was president, you could see Republicans and Democrats were essentially tied on their sort of intent to vote, their certainty to vote back then. And because there are generally more Democrats in the population, that's generally a good thing for, if they're tied, that's good for Democrats. But now we see a Republican advantage on this intent to vote, about 4 points. Again, not huge, but in close elections, even a few points matter. And this is really just sort of that enthusiasm difference, right? Republicans are a little bit more engaged, a little bit more enthusiastic about voting right now, which, suggests that the midterm elections are probably going to be more favorable towards Republicans. And if you sort of look back at historical precedents, there's only about 1 in 10 midterm elections where the incumbent party holds on to power or gains seats. Most of the time, the party out of power, so that would be the Republicans, gain seats, oftentimes a lot of seats. So when we're sort of looking at what we're expecting to happen this fall, and this is again based on where we are right now, things may change. We don't know if the situation in Ukraine is going to cause this to evolve, or if the pandemic finally gets behind us and maybe causes it to evolve. But at least right now, where the data is with Biden's approval rating and the Republican versus Democrat position on these issues, it looks like there's about a 1 in 10 chance of Democrats holding on to control of Congress, about a 4 in 10 chance of Republicans taking control by a small margin. So that's maybe not taking both chambers, maybe just taking one or the other chamber, but taking control of something. And then about a 5 in 10, or about 1 in 2 chance of sort of big win by Republicans, where they take control by a relatively large number of seats in the Senate or the House. And again, this is where we are right now, likely to change as the year unfolds, but this is where we are looking ahead about 8-9 months. And that's it. So if you have any questions, again, please use that Q&A option in the GoToWebinar function, and I am happy to answer them. All right, first question is, how will Ukraine affect views of Biden? It's unclear yet. Right now, we actually did an ABC poll a couple of weeks ago, so it's sort of a little bit old now, but what we did see is that approval of Biden's handling of sort of Russia and Ukraine was moderate to sort of poor, sort of 30 to 40% approve, slightly more disapproved. But it was very much sort of in line with a lot of those other sort of second tier issues. So I don't think it was necessarily people thinking about Biden specifically on Ukraine and more about just how they felt about Biden generally. It'll be, I think it's an open question on how it's going to, this crisis is going to affect views of Biden, and, you know, perhaps his performance will also feed into that, but I would not expect it, honestly, to have a huge impact on his overall sort of approval ratings. Maybe it helps him a couple of points, maybe it hurts him a couple of points, but it's not going to drastically change his fundamental position, which is, you know, his approval ratings in the low to mid 40s. The Ukraine crisis, you know, may move that a couple of points in one way or the other, but isn't going to fundamentally shift it, you know, hugely in one direction or the other. What about these freedom convoys? Will that have an impact on the election? Well, so yeah, that's a good question. So if you haven't been following the news, there was a protest that was organized in Canada, was centered in Ottawa for the last couple of weeks, months at this point maybe, that was basically sort of organized as truck drivers, because there was talks about requiring vaccination to drive across the border into the United States. They were opposing that, and it kind of shut Ottawa down for a while. And then there's been a lot of talk about sort of the freedom truckers coming into the States and sort of driving that. Now, there's been actually a bunch of reporting recently about how much these truck drivers were actually sort of an organization of sort of the alt-right and sort of very conservative activist groups. And, you know, in Canada, like 90% of truckers were already vaccinated. So, you know, who's complaining? But the reality, though, is these kind of things are very compelling TV, and it's more a strong media strategy than it is necessarily a social movement. You know, and having these sort of events unfold in the United States and Biden looking sort of like unable to deal with it just sort of adds to sort of the idea that Biden's not really doing a lot to deal with society, even if it has no actual impact on anyone's actual lives, right? You know, I think that's sort of the potential impact. So I would say probably it won't have a major impact, but it could potentially sort of, again, just provide a couple of cycles of negative press for the administration, for the White House. Let's see. Do you think recently passed voting restrictions in competitive states will have a large role in the outcome of the election, the midterm elections? Potentially. So, you know, Georgia, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, a bunch of states have passed sort of new laws about voting to essentially make it a little bit harder to vote. I mean, not a lot harder to vote, but a little bit harder to vote. But also a lot of sort of new laws sort of governing the process of elections, sort of the administering of elections. I think it's worrisome, but I think that's also sort of an insider kind of issue that the broad public isn't necessarily going to be aware of. And I think right now, looking at sort of the survey data we have, you know, these sort of voter restrictions will matter if they're very close elections. They could tilt it towards the Republican side in very close elections. But honestly, the data doesn't really suggest that it's going to be that close, in which case I don't think that these restrictions are going to have a huge impact. Though, again, who knows, things may change. I think what's more worrisome is in 2024, When we are likely to see a closer election, presidential years usually have higher turnout. Democrats generally look better. What impact will it have then? But, you know, that's 2.5 years from now. I think we still have to sort of see how it actually works. And if, you know, if the Republican Party is going to sort of use these levers to sort of change the rules on how ballots are tallied sort of midstream, I think there's a lot of unclarity about that and how much of, you know, these laws are sort of posturing and how much of it's actually going to be put into play. Will Biden's selection of the next Supreme Court justice negatively impact Democrats in the midterms? I think it depends a little bit on exactly who he picks and how it rolls out. I don't think actually selection of Supreme Court justices has a huge impact on the Democratic side. It has a bit more of an impact on the Republican side because the Republicans have been much more focused on the Supreme Court as a campaign issue. You know, so I don't think it'll actually matter much. I think it's not going to necessarily drive a lot. If, you know, again, I think the Biden administration is struggling to give Democrats something to be excited about. So far, their handling of the Supreme Court seat has not been has not generated a lot of excitement. So, you know, I think it's going to be sort of a net sort of break even, not necessarily a net positive. And then we'll see sort of if Republicans are able to gin up a lot of enthusiasm around it. I honestly don't think that this will be one of the top tier Republican issues in the election. I think that's going to be more, you know, the 2020 election or critical race theory or COVID restrictions will be sort of more top of mind because, you know, Republicans already have 6 of the 9 seats in the Supreme Court anyways. But yeah, I think for Democrats, it's unlikely to be something that is going to really help them a lot. How much of a following and influence does Trump have on the voting population in general? So that's a good question, and it sort of depends on exactly what you mean by influence, and it depends on the specific context. So the American public's basically divided into thirds: a third Democrat, a third Republican, a third non-political, basically. They call them independent, but they basically just don't take part in politics. They don't vote, things like that. Within that third that is Republican, about half of them are really dyed-in-the-wool Trump supporters, you know, hardcore Trump people. The other half are very staunch Republicans, you know, conservative, et cetera. And like if it's Trump versus Democrat, are always going to support Trump. But within the party, there is maybe a little bit of disagreement, right? And I think that is that will be one of the sort of the storylines for the rest of this year and going into 2024 is, does Trump maintain hold over the Republican Party, or does that sort of other half of the Republican Party that isn't necessarily as loyal to him personally sort of wrest control of it? And, you know, honestly, it's individuals who are sort of looking out for themselves, right? So like DeSantis, the governor of Florida, he's ambitious. He wants to run for president, I think. He certainly seems to be making motions towards that. You know, he's going to make noise towards being loyal to Trump, but he's also looking out for his own interest, right? So it's not, and he follows a very sort of Trumpy playbook of sort of culture war issues and sort of grievance politics and stuff. But like, you know, the personal loyalty to Trump versus loyalty to himself, I think that's really the dimension you're going to be looking at in the Republican Party going forward are the sort of the individuals who are, you know, trying to raise their own profile going to be able to sort of push the people who are loyal to Trump to the side a little bit to sort of move the party and, you know, not in a new direction, but behind new people, basically. How much of an impact will critical race theory, I guess I brought that up, right, have on the election? So CRT is, I think, kind of like these freedom convoys a little bit, but it benefits from sort of having it benefits from sort of being able to really neutralize something that has traditionally been a Democratic advantage, which is education. You know, you look back at American public opinion for the last couple of decades, and the American public has generally said Democrats are better on education. CRT gets people kind of fired up, even though they don't really know what it is. And it makes it hard for Democrats to sort of talk about sort of their traditional strengths in education. You know, but I think much like the freedom convoys, critical race theory is more of a media strategy than it is an actual social movement. Indeed, when we did polling on the topic, and I think I might have shared it in one of these webinars, and we asked people, do you support teaching critical race theory in school? And like Americans are, you know, more no than yes. And then we asked, do you support teaching the legacy of slavery and racism in schools? And the large majority of Americans say yes. You know, so there's a little bit of a mismatch between what people think CRT necessarily is, which is because I think it doesn't, you know, I don't think it actually means anything. I think it's just, again, a media strategy. But what it does is every time you have a Democrat getting interviewed and they're being asked about CRT, they're not talking about an issue that is better suited for them, you know, the economy or, you know, stopping COVID or what have you. Not that Democrats have lots of good issues right now. That's kind of part of their problem. But it does, I think, essentially make it noisier and more crowded and gets people sort of fired up and doesn't necessarily give the Democrats sort of anything good to talk about. And I think that's, you know, that's why it's a media strategy. All right, those are all the questions I have today. So this will be available on the Ipsos website. You can certainly go on, pull down the slide deck, use them if you'd like, watch this again if you want. If you do have any other questions that come to mind, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'll be doing our next webinar in April. We'll be skipping to 2 months, April 26th. We'll be sort of right in the midst of the primaries by then, so we'll actually have some early election returns. We'll start to know a little bit more clear who's going to be running for Senate, for instance, or governors in some states. So, you know, please join us then. But until then, you know, be well. Make sure to check out our website for all of our latest public opinion data. And thank you very much. Take care.